Welcome to In the Loop, the podcast series which peers into the world of health and social care, and where we attempt to ask some of the big questions affecting the sector and explore the thinking of those who are observing, leading, and hopefully shaping the future. My name's Neil Dixon, former broadcaster and health leader, and my colleague is another former health leader and prolific commentator, Roy Lilly. Hello, Roy.
Neil, good afternoon.
Today our guest is, for us, a departure. Tas Qureshi is an NHS surgeon based in Poole, Dorset. What makes him different from his colleagues is that Tas also works in Gaza, one of, if not the most dangerous place on earth. Our discussion is not intended to delve into the rights and wrongs of what's happening in Gaza. There are plenty of other fora who do that, with and without their biases and perspectives. Our aim here is to do something a bit different. It is to explore what it is like to operate, literally operate, in such a terrible environment, surrounded by danger, despair, and death. Roy, what are you hoping to hear from our guest today?
He's a fascinating character. When you hear his story, why he goes there, I'd really like to get under the skin of his motivation and how he deals with his family at home. I mean, they must be worried to death. So aside from all the difficulties that there are, and as you say, in operating there, the logistics and the lack of electricity and the bombs going off, how does he cope with it personally? How does he deal with the disasters and the dreadful things he must see?
I mean, there are parallels, obviously. There are, first of all, people involved in military conflict, including military folk who operate in very dangerous environments. There's another stream which he also represents, which is doctors who do pro bono work, who work in all sorts of places around the world for no reward. But of course, he's combining the two, isn't he? He's bringing together both of those things. It's both the danger and also the enormous effort that he's making to help others who are in a desperate situation.
But it's going back that fascinates me. What draws him back then? What is it about this man that says, I'll go back, not once, not twice, but again and again, and puts himself in the danger that he does?
Indeed. Well, Tas, a warm welcome. What if I could begin simply by asking you to reflect a bit on why you do what you do?
I have been going to Gaza since 2019. And I was asked by a British charity to upskill the surgeons in Gaza. So as you probably know, Gaza is an enclave where you're not allowed in or out without permission. So there are people, my background is I'm a surgeon. I do cancer surgery, surgical oncology, amongst other things. And people in Gaza, once they're diagnosed with cancer, a lot of them are dying unnecessarily from cancers. So what I started doing was upskilling the surgeons within Gaza so that people who are diagnosed with cancer have access to a suitably trained surgeon. So that's how my story started. And they're called surgical missions, and I was going every so often.
So how often?
So COVID hit. So the first time I went was December 2019, and then March 2020, I was meant to be going every 3 to 6 months. But March 2020, COVID had other ideas. So that was reignited in 2022. I also have a full-time NHS job, so leave and things is quite restrictive. And so it turned out being every 6 months or so.
And how long did you go for, or did you?
Surgical missions were 5 days. So we would land in Ben Gurion and go through the Eretz crossing and then perform the surgeries, amongst other things, and then come away, hopefully with some learning shared over that mission. And we were training not just the consultant surgeons, but the trainees. So this is about future-proofing Gaza. You teach the person who's starving how to fish. You don't just keep giving them fish and come back and do podcasts and Instagram and things. So there was hopefully sustainability in what I was trying to do. My surgical mission next scheduled was 14th to the 19th of October, 2023. And because of the 7th of October, obviously that was cancelled. But then I was asked to go on standby and to go as one of the first emergency medical teams. So I was one of the first emergency medical teams to go into Gaza in January 2024. And I do advocacy because I'm their voice and they've asked me to be their voice. The title of my advocacy talks is The Diaries of an Unsuspecting War Surgeon. This was never the plan. I was in the wrong place at the right time. I'm a cancer surgeon, but then out of necessity. And I say this, as to why do you go? Because it's the right thing to do. But also, if your friend asks you to go, these are dignified, honourable people. And if they say help, go. That's what you do. So that's the reason I go. I can't come up with a better reason than that. So I went in January 2024. And of course, it's a very, very different experience to doing cancer surgery outside of a conflict zone. And that's how the story started. And since then, I've been 3 times now in the war.
If you just sort of cast your mind back when you first went there, what sort of standard are the doctors at? Because as you say, it's an enclave. I mean, I've been to Gaza myself. I know how difficult it is to get in and out. How do the doctors train? How do they get to, I mean, the Royal College of Surgeon standards? I mean, just give us a bit of a background, Taz, on, how their careers progress.
We assume just because we see them on social media, wherever we see them dusty and dishevelled with shoes that are broken with holes in their clothes. And there's an assumption that these are uneducated ruffians, for want of a better word. Gaza has the highest number of PhD students in the world.
Really?
These people are incredibly eloquent, very educated, because there's an emphasis on education, because they know that the only way they can survive in an area like that is to become self-sufficient. They are some of the best surgical trainees I've ever encountered.
How do they acquire their knowledge?
They are incredibly good trauma surgeons out of necessity, because that's all they do is trauma. And I say this slightly controversially that, if I'm an NGO and I'm going with the incentive to go and teach them how to do trauma, then you're kidding yourself. I mean, how many times does a trauma surgeon in the West see an airstrike? How many times does a surgeon in the West see an explosion? It's once in a lifetime, potentially. So the Manchester surgeons that saw the Manchester bombings, they've not seen anything before or since. These people are seeing Manchester equivalents every 3 to 4 times a day, potentially. So they're incredibly good at doing those sorts of things. But what they need help with is all the regular stuff. So like the cancer, what we call the elective stuff. So that's what missions like mine were meant to do, is to actually upskill them. To be a surgeon, it's about the mindset. It's not just about the skills. And if you've got the mindset, you can teach anybody to be a surgeon. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way, that actually you can train surgeons to be very good if they have the right mindset. And their mindset is second to none. They are literally like sponges. Literally, you teach them once and they don't forget. And I was very humbled this time I went, because one of the trainees that was there last time with me and learnt from me with the lectures that I did, he was then displaced into the north of Gaza. So he couldn't come and see me this time. I've just come back a couple of months ago. So he would text me, and he was saying he was using the words that I was using. He's teaching the people the stuff that I taught him. So can you see, it's like a hub and spoke mechanism. If you teach the right people, then they disseminate the information. So they're incredibly innovative, very intelligent, and actually incredibly rewarding to teach. You teach them once, and they don't forget. In areas where learning and teaching is a right, people tend to be a bit more precious about teaching, and it takes a bit more work to teach people.
So just to be clear, when you first went in, you were passing on your skills and the advanced stuff you were doing in cancer, and people were learning, both those trainees but also regular doctors. But then you advanced to a very different situation where the war zone is all around. So how does that work now? You're not teaching cancer stuff now, you're just supporting a trauma, or are you still doing cancer work?
Yes and no. So, you might then say, well, actually, if you don't think you can teach them anything in trauma, why do you go? Well, they've been doing trauma 24/7 for the last 2 years. They need a rest, number one. Number two, they're your friends. And the fact that you go and put yourself in that position is very powerful to them, because they think the world has forgotten them. So it's my way of saying that, look, I do give a damn and we do care. So that's the reason. But what we've also got to remember is that, so give or take, Gaza is 2.2 million people. And forget the Harvard figures now where they think, there's 400,000 people missing there or thereabouts. If we just go by the documented people that have died, which is upwards of 60,000 people, the whole healthcare system, in order to treat that 60,000 people, has been completely switched off in order to look after the trauma. They've not got time to do anything else. But let's just say that's, argument's sake, that's 5-10% of the population. That means that 90 to 95% of the population of the last 2 years have been ignored with regular diseases that regular people get. So things like diabetes, things like strokes, things like heart attacks, and in my sphere, things like inflammatory bowel disease, things like endometriosis, but things like cancer, which out of those 3 things, cancer is life-limiting. So when I go out there, I try to introduce some form of normality in amongst the airstrikes. So there are times when you can do things. So my teaching time, a lecture, I would give lectures. I don't know if you've seen a film called Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner, build it and they will come. It's about baseball. So, set up a lecture theatre and they'll just come. They started coming. So they knew that Mr. Q would be teaching between 12 and 2 every day, circumstances allowing. It started off with medical students, and then it grew to trainees, and it grew in the end to consultants coming as well, because they just want to be taught. They want to feel normal. But to go back to your question, that yes, a lot of what I'm doing is trauma, but actually I'm trying to look after the people that have been ignored for the last year or 2 years. So the person with cancer, trying to operate on those people, trying to find them isn't easy. Because, it's not as if you can pick up a telephone and say, that cancer you had, can you come in? Because if they have got mobile signal, these people are displaced many times over. You can't find them. So what we did this time, and there's a film, the Gaza doctors films that was commissioned by the BBC and that wasn't shown. But there's an individual, I won't name him, but there was an individual who was mentioned, who was abducted and was then released from the state Taman prison. He was released actually on my second last trip while I was there, and it's a very emotional moment. He was released one day and came to work the next. That's what he did. But this time he was very innovative. And by the way, being oppressed or being poor, you become innovative. So what he did is he put out a social media message. It was like a broadcast that Mr. Qureshi's here. Anybody with these problems, come and see us. And so we were inundated with 100, 150 people, and that actually furnished me with enough cases to do over the month that I was there. So it's trying to do those things. So I said again that yes, to do the trauma, but let's not ignore the other people. And we think that bare minimum over 60,000 people have died from trauma. But if you were to count the number of people that have died from other diseases which aren't documented, which actually we don't know, that number may even be many times over the number of trauma cases that we know have died. So it was to try to, do the cancer surgery as well.
You're obviously doing an awful lot of good. Can you also reflect on what it's done for you personally? Have you learned a lot, both at the skill surgeon, doctor level, but also at the personal level?
So the thing I would say I've learned most is non-technical. I've learned about the Palestinians and how they are so dignified, how humble they are. But you learn about resilience. You learn about how to cope in horribly adverse circumstances. So it's the non-personal stuff that I've learned most. There are some surgical things, no doubt, because I live a very privileged life. I work in a hospital. Whatever you say about the NHS, we have robots, for example. This year is the 10th year I've had a robot. But what people in places like conflict zones or anywhere where there is a lack of facilities, they become incredibly innovative. They know what they want to do, but they'll make it happen in another way. So it's learning those sorts of things. Say, well, do you know what? I didn't even think of that. Well, that would work back in the NHS.
When you go to these extraordinarily dangerous environments, how did your family cope?
Well, I joke about it, and my wife dropped me off at the airport this time. I turned around to say an emotional goodbye, and she was doing a wheel spin and a handbrake turn out of the car park, just in case she changed her mind. But joking aside, the majority of my children are older, in their 20s and earning salaries. I don't just go without permissions. So my elderly mother is still alive. I ask permission because it would be a very selfish thing for me to do to put them in that situation. But the apple never falls far from the tree. I'm like this because of my parents, my father and my mother. They've nurtured me in a certain way, and that's maybe why I'm like this. My children hopefully think similarly. But I ask permissions. They understand it's difficult. But my bit's the easy bit. You get engrossed in work and time flies. But I can't imagine what it's like being here, looking at your watch every second of every day, wondering what's happening now.
Watching television news.
The reason I'm doing things like this, again, I appreciate the invitation, but is to make sure that we remember what's happening there and stop this from becoming page news. I say this often, this is not a race, colour, creed, politics thing. This is purely a thing about humanity. We have failed as humanity to help the human beings, whether that's in Gaza or any other field of conflict. And I just purely do this as a humanitarian.
I suppose you might say something similar about Ukraine. What about your employer? How does the NHS stand up in this? Do you have to take personal leave, or do they help you? Or
So I've always trained, that's what I've done. So I have something called professional leave. I trained surgeons within the United Kingdom how to do keyhole surgery. So There used to be a cancer star called Professor Sir Mike Richards. So he set up a training program called the LAPCO training program. And I was one of the consultants that taught on that and taught and disseminated safe keyhole surgeries to within the United Kingdom. So maybe that's why I was chosen by the charity, because I had a pedigree in teaching other consultants. But the answer is that, words are weaponized. And so I try to be, I'm actually a very boring, safe person. So when I go, I talk to a few key stakeholders. So my chief medical officer knows, the chief executive knows, the medical director, the lead medic in the hospital knows. So I go with permissions, in inverted commas, or just to let them know this is where I'm going. And I've done presentations within the hospital, and before the presentations, I say that this is what I'm going to do. You're more than welcome to come. And I'm due to give a talk to the hospital board so they understand that my testimony is purely a descriptive witness testimony. It's not a political statement.
How have your colleagues reacted to this? You can know somebody's doing this, but you can't really understand what they're going through, I guess.
So I've presented to the hospital trust as a whole, so people know what I've done. I think it's very difficult to try to say to somebody, how was it? How do you talk to somebody? You don't know whether they're traumatized and how will I react. I don't do it for favour or for reward or for somebody to say, I'll do it for other reasons. My reward is just trying to do the right thing. I'm sorry if that sounds really corny and really cheesy, but I haven't ever told people what I do from 2019 till 2023 because it's very personal. That's my business. You might say, well, why am I doing things like this? And the reason is because we know what's happened to journalists in Gaza. So we go as NGOs and we are pleaded with to say, please tell our story. So I just tell people's stories. That's all I'm doing.
Just take us back into Gaza for a moment. Do you feel frightened during your time there, or can you somehow shut that out? Because you are in personal danger, obviously.
Well, if you remember, there were 4 British doctors that were hit by an airstrike. So I was one of those 4 British doctors. So yes, I do know what it's like. I shouldn't be here. Generally, I'm not frightened. I've got a strong family around me. I'm a man of faith. And what will be, will be. But even as a surgeon, I'm very, not emotionless, but I have to be robotic. Because if you become emotional, you cannot function. If you have got a room full of children on the floor with burns and missing limbs and missing bits of face, and you have to choose, I've only got one bit of medication for all these children and one ITU bed. And if you become emotional, you fall to pieces. So actually, I become very blinkered, and that's maybe one thing I'm lucky with, that this very dour way I speak is actually the way I am in theatres, and hopefully my theatre team would say the same. You empower the team around you, but actually if the surgeon panics, what's everybody else going to do?
And that is your original training coming into force in a different circumstance, but with huge additional pressure.
I think it's a personality type. I've worked with surgeons that shout and scream in theatre. That actually, if people want to work for you and you empower them and give them a sense of worth, then things work.
I take that, and I absolutely understand what you're saying. I think the point I was making was around the extent to which you get emotional with the patient who you're dealing with. And it is part of your training as a doctor to be empathetic and to relate to the people you're operating on. But you're also taught to have that degree of professionalism that you can't get emotionally involved with every single patient who has cancer or whatever else. Now, the situation you're in Gaza is that with extra pressure, isn't it?
I'm operating and there's airstrikes happening all the time. This time I went, the hospital I was working in was hit 3 times. We were told this time we went that healthcare workers are seen as legitimate targets for whatever reason. And you're operating here and an airstrike will hit maybe a kilometre away. The doors here will be flying open and closed. You have to leave those doors and windows open because of the pressure effect, otherwise everything shatters. The doors and windows are flying open and it's almost like a poltergeist. You're in a theatre that feels like it's possessed. But the pressure of dealing with what you're dealing with outweighs the pressure of what might happen to you, and you become that horrible sort of cliched phrase, in the zone. You just become very focused.
Take us to Gaza on your last visit and give us a day.
You have to go to the guest house for the first day. I'm not going to call it a safe house because it's not a safe house. And then you're driven to Nasser Hospital the next day, and I stayed there for the whole time until time to come out. So that was 30 days. The journey from the guest house to the hospital, which I'd done before in January, and this time it was just absolute annihilation, just a pile of rubble. And that's just the physical construction cost, but there's a huge human cost to that as well, obviously. There are people who've yet not been found within that rubble. As soon as you get to the hospital, the one thing you realise very quickly is there's no food, or there's limited food. So as an NGO, I lost a lot of weight, and I don't have a problem with that because I had the entitlement to come out and regain the weight. But as part of the guilt now is that, there are people who've not had fruit for 6 months. There's people who've not eaten meat for a year. So what we ate as NGOs was whatever our NGO could hoard. So it's things that, in cans. They only ate once a day because I didn't think it was fair to be eating 2-3 times a day where people around you who are looking after you are also limited in what they can eat. So a typical meal would be hummus from a can and fava beans, full they call it, and stale bread because they ran out of flour a while ago. So that was a typical meal. We had our filter bottles, military filter bottles, so it doesn't matter whether the water's clean or not, you can filter it. So that was a typical day of food. A typical day would be you may or may not get sleep. It depends. There's an alarm within the hospital that goes up every time there's an airstrike. They call them MCIs, mass casualty incidents. And if there's an MCI, you just go to casualty. And that's where you see the carnage. That's the most difficult thing, deciding who you're going to pick, who's got the golden ticket to actually will treat you. For example, one day there was an airstrike and there were 60 children brought in, strewn across the floor, blood, missing limbs, everything. But the point is, you haven't got enough resource to treat them all. And a lot of them are going to die. They might take many hours to die, but therefore they're going to die in absolute agony over that many hours. And you can't, what we call palliate them, which means give them medication to ease the final hours on this earth. But perhaps more distressing for those children is, who do you need at a time like that? You need your parents. And often the parents have died in those circumstances. So that's a window into the trauma of a typical day. And then you'd clean up, and we had elective cases, the cancer cases to do, the teaching to do. And that every now and again was interrupted by another airstrike. And that's within a theatre of actually a war happening outside. So there are airstrikes all the time, but you never see the aeroplanes. You hear them, but obviously you never see lights at night. You just don't. But this is the first time I saw aeroplanes. If you go to an air show and when the jets pass you, there's that exhilaration of the reverberation as the afterburners Well, the afterburners turned on as these 3 jets passed over NASA Hospital. So I saw the 3 round afterburners as the jets went off to do whatever they were going to do. So that's not an unusual day. And then if you manage to get to bed, the whole hospital is shaking with the airstrikes. What we've got to remember also is that, in any other theatre of war as an NGO, if the fighting gets to within 30 kilometres, they think about extracting you because it's too dangerous. Gaza being 40 by 12 kilometres, give or take, it has to get to half a kilometre before they think about it. And that's what they tell you, okay, we'll extract you. But how on earth are you going to extract me? So last time I was there in January, when the scariest night I had wasn't actually the airstrike, that was a short, sharp shot. But there was a night where we were cut off completely. The tanks surrounded the hospital. There was no Wi-Fi, there was no internet. And you're hearing missiles, you're hearing people talking, you're hearing shooting, you're hearing firing. And Chinese whispers how they're coming just to get the NGOs, and they're only going to get the NGOs of white hair, so the Chinese whispers. And I didn't know how that story was going to end. I'll tell you, quite a poignant moment on that evening was that we were told to go to the centre of the hospital, which happened to be theatres, because if the tanks hit the outside, that's the safest place to be, if the airstrike hit the outside. But one of the anaesthetists took us to a back way to see a road outside. And there's a song called Road to Nowhere. And I looked out with all this carnage going on. There was a steady stream of people coming out of these houses with children and their blankets and their boxes, and literally the road to nowhere. They were just going south. They didn't know where to go, but the whole night was difficult because I didn't know how the story was going.
Can I just ask you about the airstrike that hit you?
So I was a victim of that. I'll tell you the testimony, the UN testimony, the British government testimony that was given to us. So in advance of the emergency medical teams, we had an American surgeon with us. So the American military and the British military shared the coordinates with these safe houses in December 2023 and say these are no-go zones. This is just purely a humanitarian zone. And the scary night where I said the tanks surrounded, that was the first time after I don't know how many days we said we need a timeout. Let's go back to the guest house just to freshen up and then we'll come back. You have to get deconfliction from the Israeli ministry to say, yes, you can make that journey. And if that journey is in an area where they're going to be doing some activity, they'll tell you no. So we were given deconfliction and we went back to the guest house. And then later that day, we'd freshened up and we were ready to come back, do some more work. And we were not allowed to leave the guest house. So we stayed in the guest house. So it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. It was dark. I was in a room with one of the doctors and the two doctors in the other room and the numeric doctor. And we were hearing aeroplanes all the time, but this time we heard a missile, the whine of the missile. And then I saw a flash of light followed by sound. But again, analogies in films, The Wizard of Oz, when the house is lifted up off its moorings and then dropped down, it felt like that's what happened to us. The ceiling caved in, the windows caved in, things fell just shy of my bed. And then there's always two, drop one payload, drop the other payload. And we were waiting for the next one, and for whatever reason, it didn't happen. And then the humour comes out, and and then we got up and witnessed what happened. The next day, the UN came. The reason these were chosen as safe houses was, number one, because in years gone by, they are nice holiday homes. And if you want to go to a nice holiday home, it's actually quite a way away from the other home. So they were isolated. So nobody could say, "Oh, really sorry, we're aiming for that, and we're really sorry got you." But the other thing is, this is right on the coast, so the house is built on sand. So nobody can then say, "Oh, there were tunnels under the house." So that's why the British military chose these as safe houses. But, the rest is history, as they say.
And was anybody killed in that particular
Not killed. We were injured, superficial injuries. And the UN came the next day. Like I said, these testimonies aren't my opinion. These are what people tell me. And the UN came the next day and they said that the size of the missile fragments were a lot bigger than they expected. And the reason they think that is because we were on sand and the sand acted like a sandbag and stopped the missile doing what they needed to do.
I've got one other question. When you're doing the trauma work, are you speaking in English?
These are incredibly intelligent, eloquent people whose spoken English is probably better than a lot of people in England. We use slang, but they use very correct English. So English is order of the day.
Thank you for telling us an extraordinary story. I'm sure all our listeners will agree when I say you are an extraordinary man, and thank you for what you do.
Indeed, thank you very much. You've given us a glimpse of this conflict, but also many other conflicts that people find quite difficult to follow. And of course, you see things on television, but in some ways, I think the word is almost more powerful because it enables people to take the time to digest what you've said and really take it on board. Thank you.
Well, as they say, follow that. He's just an extraordinary man, isn't he? And in fact, getting him to do this was a bit of a struggle, because, as much as he wants to be an advocate for what's going on there, he says it's not about me and, I'll do it if it's about the work that I do and, everyone listening can make their mind up. But he's just such an extraordinary man.
I thought he painted such a vivid picture, almost more than you'd get just watching a piece of film where you hear distressed people or you see awful injuries and so forth. But you really felt you were there.
Yes.
And also, I thought the combination of his, in a humble way, doing trauma work, where he's not an expert and he recognises they're have a lot more expertise than he does. But it's important for him to do that. But that he is still continuing to teach and he is still continuing to share his expertise in cancer and so forth. And he made the point a few times, the thirst these people in the most awful of circumstances have for learning, that they want to learn. They're innovative and that they want to learn. I thought those were things I'd never thought about properly, I think, before I heard him.
Yes, and there's a phrase that comes to mind that was said to me a long, long time ago. It says, if you were born where they were born, you would be like them. And it's the luck of the draw where you're born, isn't it? We could be like them. And I hope that you enjoyed sharing this with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yes, indeed, we'll be reverting to our more normal cast list, if that's the right way, as we continue to explore what is happening, particularly in this country, in England predominantly, but at some point we should look across the rest of the UK as well. And we're certainly in the midst of very interesting times where, in some senses, there does seem some greater hope, but there are also very significant impediments to those who believe that the NHS can be transformed in a moment.
Indeed.
Thank you and goodbye.